Howdy do, squirrels. Back to read to you guys. Okay. The Aunt, whatever her name is, Aunt Plummy, she was talking. She said, so rum sellers say, but it ain't a good trade to foller, and I'd chop wood 'fore I'd earn my living harming my feller man. 'Pears to me I'd let my oven cool a spell and hunt up some homely happy folks to write about. Folks that don't borrow trouble and go looking for holes in their neighbors' coats, but take their lives brave and cheerful in remembering we are all human. Have pity on the weak and try to be as full of mercy, patience, and loving kindness as Him, capital H, who made us. That sort of a book would do a heap of good, be real warming and strengthening, and make them that read it love the man that wrote it, and remember him when he was dead and gone. I wish I could, and Randall meant what he said, for he was as tired of his own style as a watchmaker might be, of the magnifying glass through which he strains his eyes all day. He knew that the heart was left out of his work, and that both mind and soul were growing morbid, with dwelling on the faulty, absurd, and metaphysical phases of life and character. He often threw down his pen and vowed he would write no more. But he loved ease, and the books brought money readily. He was accustomed to the stimulant of praise, and missed it, as the toper misses his wine, so that which had once been a pleasure to himself and others was fast becoming a burden and a disappointment. The brief pause which followed his involuntary betrayal of discontent was broken by Ruth, who exclaimed with a girlish enthusiasm that overpowered girlish bashfulness, I think all the novels are splendid. I hope you'll write hundreds more, and I shall live to read 'em. Bravo, my little champion. I promise that I will write one more at least, and have a heroine in it whom your mother will both admire and love, answered Randall, surprised to find how grateful he was for the girl's approval, and how rapidly his trained fancy began to paint the background on which he hoped to copy this fresh human daisy. Abashed by her involuntary outburst, Ruth tried to efface herself behind Saul's broad shoulder, and he brought the conversation back to its starting point by saying in a tone of the most sincere interest, speaking of the serial, I'm very anxious to know how your hero comes out. He's a fine fellow, and I can't decide whether he is going to spoil his life marrying that silly woman, or do something grand and generous and not be made a fool of. Upon my soul, I don't know myself. It's very hard to find new finales. Can't you suggest something, Major? Then I shall not be obliged to leave my story without an end, as people complain I'm rather fond of doing. Well, no, I don't think I've anything to offer. Seems to me it isn't the sensational exploits that show the hero best, but some great sacrifice quietly made by a common sort of man who was noble without knowing it. I saw a good many such during the war, and often wish I could write them down, for it is surprising how much courage, goodness, and real piety is stowed away in common folks, ready to show when the right time comes. Tell us one of them, and I'll bless you for a hint. No one knows the anguish of an author's spirit when he can't ring down the curtain on an effective tableau, said Randall, with a glance at his friends to ask their aid in eliciting an anecdote or reminiscence. Tell about the splendid fellow who held the bridge like Horatius till help came." "That was a thrilling story, I assure you," answered Sophie with an inviting smile. But Saul would not be his own hero, and said briefly, "Any man can be brave when the battle fever is on him, and it only takes a little physical courage to dash ahead." He paused a moment with his eyes on the snowy landscape without, where twilight was deepening. Then, as if constrained by the memory that winter scene evoked, he slowly continued, "One of the bravest things I ever knew was done by a poor fellow who has been a hero to me ever since, though I only met him that night. It was after one of the big battles of that last winter, and I was knocked over with a broken leg and 2 or 3 bullets here and there. Night was coming on, snow falling, and a sharp wind blew over the field where a lot of us lay, dead and alive, waiting for the ambulance to come and pick us up. There was skirmishing going on not far off, and our prospects were rather poor between frost and fire. I was calculating how I'd manage when I found 2 poor chaps close by who were worse off, so I braced up and did what I could for them. One had an arm blown away and kept up a dreadful groaning. The other was shot bad and bleeding to death for want of help, but never complained. He was nearest, and I liked his pluck, for he spoke cheerful and made me ashamed to growl. Such times make dreadful brutes of men if they haven't something to hold on to, and all 3 of us were most wild with pain and cold and hunger, for we'd fought all day fasting. When we heard a rumble in the road below, I saw lanterns bobbing round. That meant life to us, and we all tried to holler. 2 of us were pretty faint, but I managed a good yell, and they heard it. 'Room for one more. Hard luck, old boys, but we're full and must save the worst wounded first. Take a drink and hold on till we come back,' says one of 'em with the stretcher. 'Here's the one to go,' I says, pointing out my man, for I saw by the light that he was hard hit. 'No, that one. He's got more chances than I. Or this one. He's young and got a mother.' 'I'll wait,' said the good feller, touching my arm, for he'd heard me muttering to myself about this dear old lady we always want mother when we're down, you know." Saul's eyes turned to the beloved face with a glance of tenderest affection, and Aunt Plummy answered with a dismal groan at the recollection of his need that night in her absence. Well, to be short, the groaning chap was taken, and my man left. I was mad, but there was no time for talk, and the selfish one went off and left that poor feller to run his one chance. I had my rifle, and I guess I could hobble up to use it if need be. So we settled back to wait without much hope of help, everything being in a muddle, and wait we did till morning, for that ambulance did not come back till next day, when most of us were past needing it. I'll never forget that night. I dream it over again as plain as if it was real. Snow, cold, darkness, hunger, thirst, pain, and all round us cries, and cursing, growling less and less, till at last only the wind went moaning over that meadow. It was so awful, so lonesome, helpless, and seemingly God-forsaken. Hour after hour we lay there, side by side under one coat, waiting to be saved or die, for the wind grew strong and we grew weak. Saul drew a long breath and held his hands to the fire as if he felt again the sharp suffering of that night. "And the man?" asked Emily softly, as if reluctant to break the silence. "He was a man. In times like that, men talk like brothers and show what they are. Lying there, slowly freezing, Joe Cummings told me about his wife and babies, his old folks waiting for him, all depending on him, yet all ready to give him up when he was needed. A plain man, but honest and true and loving as a woman. I soon saw that he went on talking, half to me and half to himself, for sometimes he wandered a little toward the end. I've read books, heard sermons, and seen good folks, but nothing ever came so close or did me so much good as seeing this man die. He had one chance, and he gave it up cheerfully. He longed for those he loved, and he let them go with a goodbye they couldn't hear. He suffered all the pains we most shrink from without a murmur, and kept my heart warm while his own was growing cold. It's no use trying to tell that part of it, but I heard prayers that night that meant something, and I saw how faith could hold a soul up when everything was gone but God. Saul stopped there with a sudden huskiness in his deep voice, and when he went on, it was in the tone of one who speaks of a dear friend. Joe grew still by and by, and I thought he was asleep, for I felt his breath when I tucked him up, and his hand held on to mine. The cold sort of numbed me, and I dropped off too weak and stupid to think or feel. I never should have waked up if it hadn't been for Joe. When I came to, it was morning, and I thought I was dead, for all I could see was that great field of white mounds like graves, and a splendid sky above. Then I looked for Joe, remembering, but he had put my coat back over me and lay stiff and still under the snow that covered him like a shroud, all except his face. A bit of my cape had blown over it when I took it off, and the sun shone on his dead face. I declare to you, it was so full of heavenly peace. I felt as if that common man had been glorified by God's light and rewarded by God's well done. That's all. No one spoke for a moment while the women wiped their eyes, and Saul dropped his as if to hide something softer than tears. It was very noble, very touching. And you, how did you get off at last? Asked Randall, with real admiration and respect in his usually languid face. Crawled off, answered Saul, relapsing into his former brevity of speech. Why not before and save yourself all that misery? Couldn't leave Joe. Ah, I see. There were 2 heroes that night. Dozens, I've no doubt. Those were times that made heroes of men and women, too. Tell us more, begged Emily, looking up with an expression none of her admirers ever brought to her face by their softest compliments or wiliest gossip. I've done my part. It's Mr. Randall's turn now. And Saul drew himself out of the ruddy circle of firelight, as if ashamed of the prominent part he was playing. Sophie and her friend had often heard Randall talk, for he was an accomplished raconteur. But that night he exerted himself and was unusually brilliant and entertaining as if upon his mettle. The Bassetts were charmed. They sat late and very merry, for Aunt Plummy got up a little supper for them, and her cider was as exhilarating as champagne. When they parted for the night and Sophie kissed her aunt, Emily did the same, saying heartily, It seems as if I'd known you all my life, and this is certainly the most enchanting old place that ever was. Glad you like it, dear, but it ain't all fun, as you'll find out tomorrow when you go to work, for Sophie says you must," answered Mrs. Bassett, as her guests trooped away, rashly promising to like everything. They found it difficult to keep their word when they were called at 6:30 the next morning. Their rooms were warm, however, and they managed to scramble down in time for breakfast, guided by the fragrance of coffee and Aunt Plummy's shrill voice singing the good old hymn, "Lord, in the morning thou shalt hear." My voice ascending high, I don't know that, or I'd sing it. An open fire blazed on the hearth, for the cooking was done in the lean-to, and the spacious, sunny kitchen was kept in all its old-fashioned perfection, with the wooden settle in a warm nook, the tall clock behind the door, copper and pewter utensils shining on the dresser, old china in the corner closet, and a little spinning wheel rescued from the garret by Sophie to adorn the deep window full of scarlet geraniums, Christmas roses, and white chrysanthemums. The young lady in a checked apron and mob cap greeted her friends with a dish of buckwheats in one hand and a pair of cheeks that proved she'd been learning to fry these delectable cakes. "You do keep it up in earnest, upon my word, and very becoming it is, dear, but won't you ruin your complexion and roughen your hands if you do so much of this new fancy work?" asked Emily, much amazed at this novel freak. "I like it, and I really believe I've found my proper sphere at last. Domestic life seems so pleasant to me that I feel as if I'd better keep it up for the rest of my life," answered Sophie, making a pretty picture of herself as she cut great slices of brown bread, with the early sunshine touching her happy face. The charming Miss Vaughn, in the role of a farmer's wife, I find it difficult to imagine and shrink from the thought of the widespread dismay such a fate will produce among her adorers, added Randall, as he basked in the glow of the hospitable fire. "She might do worse, but come to breakfast and do honor to my handiwork," said Sophie, thinking of her worn-out millionaire, and rather nettled by the satiric smile on Randall's lips. "What an appetite early rising gives one! I feel equal to almost anything, so let me help wash cups," said Emily with an unusual energy. When the hearty meal was over and Sophie began to pick up the dishes as if it was her usual work, Ruth went to the window to water the flowers, and Randall followed to make himself agreeable, remembering her defense of him last night. He was used to admiration from feminine eyes and flattery from soft lips, but found something new and charming in the innocent delight which showed itself at his approach in blushes more eloquent than words, and shy glances from eyes full of hero worship. I think I'm going to stop right there, guys. Dang, does this thing not have chapters? No, but it's not that much longer. Okay. Y'all be sweet. Don't be ugly. See you later. Love y'all. Bye-bye.